Suddenly This Summer by Maurice Brinton. For those who see themselves as revolutionaries, two attitudes are possible to the events of the Polish summer. The first seeks to minimize their significance. It points out that there is nothing very radical in the demand for, quote, free trade unions, end quote, particularly when voiced by nationalist reformists, religious ones to boot. The demand is dismissed as a gigantic diversion fraught with all the dangers inherent in illusory projects. Footnote. It is worth pointing out that this label was devised by sections of the media in the West. The demand of the Gdansk MKS Inter-Factory Strike Committee was for, quote, independent self-managed unions, end quote. The term, quote, free, end quote, trade unions is a crude attempt at preemptive recuperation. It quite strongly conveys associations, if only of the verbal kind, with the, quote, free, end quote, world, the, quote, free, end quote, enterprise system, radio, quote, free, end quote, Europe, etc. The MKS and the Polish Solidarność movement, which has grown out of it, has repeatedly stated that it is not seeking the restoration of the means of production to private ownership. Of all the papers in the West, only Le Monde has correctly conveyed the full nuances of what the Polish workers are trying to create. Des syndicats indépendants et autogérés, end quote. To translate this as, quote, self-governing, end quote, unions, as the Times and the Guardian have intermittently done, is also misleading. Countries or institutions may be, quote, self-governing, end quote, jealous of their frontiers, extremely autocratic. It all depends on who the, quote, governors, end quote, are. Quote, self-managed, end quote, on the other hand, implies that the locus of power is at the base, and it doesn't preclude even very close association with similarly structured bodies. End of footnote. Rooted knee-deep in their analysis of the past, people who hold such views will argue that the trade unions are no solution to the problems of the working class. The unions, by their very essence, i.e., independently of time and place, are, quote, organs of class collaboration, end quote, prisons for the proletariat, end quote, free trade unions, end quote, such people would stress, will readily be recuperated by the Polish state. Such an attitude, for it is an attitude as much as a reasoning, reminds one of Marx's initial timidity in relation to the Paris Commune, and of Lenin's initial myopia in relation to the Soviets of 1905. Such an approach contains some seeds of abstract truth. A union is indeed just a broker of labor power under any circumstances. But it also shows great poverty of imagination and a total absence of feeling for living reality. It fails to grasp all that is new in the Polish experience. It seeks instead to interpret this experience in the categories of the past. It doesn't feel revolution as a creative act, as, quote, a conclusion that exceeds the premises, end quote, as the entry of thousands of people onto territory uncharted on anyone's political atlas. Not to sense all this shows the chasm between old-time revolutionaries whose thinking is always rooted in past revolutions and people in action who are always seeking to make the next one. The second attitude to the Polish events would say, quote, forget the words trade unions and look at the content, end quote. Autonomous self-managed organization controlled from below and involving all areas of social life. It would stress the specific geographical, historical, and cultural context in which these demands were now being voiced societies in which every area of autonomy had been ruthlessly colonized, societies in which the party leadership believed they had already achieved their objective, the social atomization of the population. The Polish Summer, in this perspective, would be seen as the first mass movement of a self-conscious working class against the institutional legacies of Leninism, i.e. against societies in which unions were conceived of as, quote, transmission belts between the party and the masses, end quote. The Gdansk strike would be an example of a tremendous upsurge of the quote, class for itself, end quote, as Marx would have said. And the action in question would be the repudiation of Marxist-Leninist objectives, even by the generations which, quote, the Marxist Party, end quote, had itself brought up. In this approach, the whole focus shifts away from weeping about the crucifixes or sniggering about the carnations. Footnote. And even here, the new approach would be both more charitable and more open. It would remember that Anna Walentynowicz, who had worked all her life in the shipyard, initially as a welder, later as a crane driver, first got into trouble with the authorities when she organized not a strike over wages, but a collection among her workmates to put flowers on the graves of her fellow workers shot down 10 years earlier. Such apparently, quote, trifling, end quote, episodes should teach us more modesty in seeking to understand what drives human beings to action and to unravel the strange matrices of identity in which such autonomous action is now embedded. End footnote. Central to this approach would be Wallace's statement that in the new organizations, delegates would not be separated from those they represented, and would in fact remain at work at least part of the time. That the organizations would seek to break down the barriers between intellectual and manual labor, that representatives would receive working men's wages, quote, or even less, end quote. That, quote, the journals of the new unions would publish whatever they wanted, whether anyone liked it or not, end quote. A sympathetic, not sentimental approach would emphasize the almost unbelievable capacity for organization and coordination shown by the strikers, which rendered the task of the state power infinitely more difficult. It would admire their practical skill rather than denounce them for some of the things they have been compelled, tongue-in-cheek, to say. The Polish Summer is a challenge at all levels to the dominant ideology in Eastern Europe. As such, it is sure to have enormous repercussions. It questions the basic doctrinal postulates which underpin these societies. These are seldom honestly stated. They are that the main demands outlined in the Communist Manifesto, quote, to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, end quote, somehow ensure the, quote, socialist, end quote, nature of the regimes that follow. They ensure no such thing, even when dished up with a new sauce tartare, the rule of the vanguard party. If revolutionaries are unaware of the challenge posed by any autonomous organization, trade union or flying university or what have you, Russia's rulers certainly aren't. Islands of autonomy in societies such as theirs are potential bases of dual power. The dike of the official lie, once breached, a whole ocean of people just seeking the truth could come pouring through. How else can we explain Russia's desperate attempt to circumscribe the focus of infection, the omission of all serious reference to the Polish events in their own press, the sudden disappearance of even, quote, Euro-communist, end quote, journals from their libraries and reading rooms, and their talk of, quote, dividing socialism from within, end quote, and their constant talks for, quote, the restoration of a democracy which conforms to Leninist norms, end quote. For Poland's rulers, things are even more bleak. We note the frightened statement of a leading Polish party member that, quote, the opposition is now inside the working class, end quote. Comrade, it is even worse than that. After the events of 1970, the workers can no longer be conned by reshuffling your party leadership. They have understood that confidence, like matches, can only be used once. Quote. No, that's not a quote. That's just the beginning of a capital T. The main opposition to Leninism in Poland is not just, quote, inside the working class, end quote. The main opposition to Leninism in Poland is the working class. And what spells your doom is that the workers know it. The situation is fraught with danger and ambiguities. Our admiration is not an admiration of voyeurs, and our support is not uncritical. But the things that worry us are not those that worry the crypto-Stalinists or those who like their revolutions, quote, pure, end quote. Jan Litinsky, editor of Robotnik, describes a visit to the miners of Vazbrzych. Quote, the men would come to the founding committee of the Union as to a new power, of which they expected both instructions and protection. Having lived for 35 years in a totalitarian state, it was hard to learn that one could defend oneself without seeking refuge behind authority, end quote. Here lies the main danger. Here, and in an excessive reliance on their new charismatic leaders who may turn out to have feet of clay. Quote, to be radical, end quote, according to Litinsky, quote, is to work to change all that, end quote. Polish workers are already deserting the official unions in their hundreds of thousands. They are joining the Solidarity Network. The old unions were indeed, quote, transmission belts, end quote, to the comfortable corridors of power. To join the new organizations, on the other hand, is to be catapulted in the opposite direction, to the very front line of contestation and political strife. It is quite naive to believe that the new unions will somehow be able to avoid finding political answers to the political onslaught that is sure to be launched against them. How seriously, in the last analysis, do we take the prescription that, quote, the emancipation of the working class is the task of the workers themselves, end quote? Is it just rhetoric, or do we really mean it? And if we mean it, why can't the class be granted the autonomy to choose its means as well as its ends, and to label them as it wishes? Solidarity supplement on Summer in Gdansk in Solidarity for Social Revolution 14, October-November 1980.